There are moments in a person's life that feel small to the world, but change everything inside them. Moments when a room full of people laughs, and you stand there alone, holding the last piece of your dignity in your trembling hands. This is one of those stories. It begins in a dusty mountain town, where pride cost more than flour, and mercy came from the one man no one thought was paying attention. The wagon had barely rolled out of sight when Clara Bennett realized she had nowhere to go. She stood at the edge of Pine Hollow's only street, her worn boots sinking into the soft red dust. The driver had not looked back. He had taken his payment and left her there with one small suitcase and a folded letter that had promised work and lodging. The letter had also promised kindness. That part had not been true. The boarding house she had been sent to was locked tight. A paper nailed to the door read "Closed for repairs." No one nearby claimed to know when it would open again. No one offered help. Clara pressed her lips together and looked down the street. Pine Hollow was the kind of place where men leaned against porch rails and watched strangers with narrowed eyes. Wooden storefronts lined the road, their paint faded by wind and sun. A blacksmith hammered iron somewhere out of sight. A stray dog slept under the shade of a wagon wheel. Her stomach twisted. She had not eaten since dawn. The general store stood near the center of town, its wide front windows displaying sacks of flour and jars of sugar as if they were treasures. The sign above the door read, "Carter's Goods and Supplies." Clara took a slow breath and walked toward it. The bell above the door rang sharp and clear when she stepped inside. The smell of tobacco and dried beans filled the air. 3 men stood near the counter. They turned as one. Behind the register stood Mr. Carter himself. Thick around the middle, sleeves rolled high, suspenders stretched across his chest. He looked her up and down slowly, taking in her faded dress, the patch at her elbow, the dust on her hem. "Well now," he said loudly, resting both hands on the counter. "Looks like another hopeful come to strike it rich." A few of the men chuckled. Clara swallowed and stepped forward. She placed her suitcase carefully by her feet, as if it held something fragile. In truth, it held almost nothing. 2 dresses, a hairbrush, a photograph of her parents. "I'm looking for work," she said. Her voice was soft but steady. "Or I'd be grateful for a little flour and salt. I can pay once I find employment." The laughter came quick this time. Mr. Carter leaned closer, squinting as if examining livestock. "You plan on paying with what exactly?" he asked. "Buttons and hope?" The men by the pickle barrel grinned. One of them shook his head. Clara felt heat crawl up her neck. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the only thing of value she owned, a small silver locket. It had belonged to her mother. The metal was worn smooth from years of touch. She placed it gently on the counter. "This," she said, "until I can repay you." "Mr." Carter picked it up, turned it in his thick fingers, then let out a loud bark of laughter that filled the store. "Why, sweetheart," he said, dropping it back on the wood with a hard clink. "That ain't worth half a sack of flour. Might not even buy you a biscuit." The room roared. Clara's fingers tightened on the edge of the counter. She would not cry. Not here. Not in front of them. She reached for the locket. Before her hand could close around it, another sound cut through the laughter. Boot steps. Slow. Heavy. Certain. They came from the far end of the store near the stacked feed sacks. A tall man stepped forward from the shadow. He wore a dark hat, pulled low over steady gray eyes. His coat was worn but clean. Dust clung to his boots and the cuffs of his trousers. He carried himself like someone used to mountain wind and long silences. He did not look at the men. He looked at Clara. Then he reached into his coat and pulled out a small leather pouch. He untied it and poured several silver coins onto the counter. The sound of metal striking wood silenced the room at once. "Give her what she asked for," he said. His voice was low and calm, but it carried. Mr. Carter's smile faded. "Now hold on, Wyatt," he began. "I didn't ask for your thoughts," the cowboy replied evenly. "Flour, salt, and a little dried meat." The shopkeeper's jaw tightened, but he reached for a sack. Clara stood frozen, her pulse loud in her ears. The silver coins lay between her and the stranger like a bridge she did not know how to cross. "I can't accept," she began. "You can," the cowboy said quietly, without looking at her. "And you will." The men in the store shifted uncomfortably. No one laughed now. Mr. Carter shoved the goods into a paper sack with sharp, angry movements. He slid it across the counter. The cowboy pushed the coins toward him. "Keep the change," he said. Clara picked up her locket and slipped it back into her pocket. Her hands trembled, but she held her head high. Outside, the afternoon sun had begun to dip behind the mountain ridge. The cowboy stepped out first. She followed, clutching the sack of food against her chest. A single horse waited at the hitching post. Dark brown, strong, patient. The man turned to her for the first time up close. "You got somewhere to stay?" he asked. Clara hesitated. "No." He studied her face for a long moment, as if weighing something deeper than words. "Then you do now," he said. "Cabin's a mile up the ridge. You can earn your keep. Fair work. Fair pay." She looked back once at the general store. Through the window she could see Mr. Carter watching them, his expression tight and unreadable. When she turned back, the mountain cowboy was already loosening the reins. Clara took a breath and stepped toward the waiting horse. She had no idea that this quiet man had been watching from the moment she entered that store, and she had no idea that Pine Hollow was about to learn something about kindness it would never forget. The road up the ridge was narrow and rough, carved into the mountainside like a scar that refused to heal. Pine trees lined the path, their branches swaying in the late wind. The town fell away behind them, smaller with every step of the horse. Clara walked beside the animal at first, her hand resting lightly on the saddle strap. The cowboy did not rush her. He let the silence stretch between them, not heavy, just steady. The only sounds were the slow rhythm of hooves against dirt and the distant call of a hawk circling above. After a while, her legs began to ache. He noticed without looking directly at her. "Ride," he said simply. She hesitated, then allowed him to lift her onto the saddle. His grip was firm but careful, like he was used to handling fragile things without breaking them. He walked beside the horse the rest of the way, one hand on the reins, guiding them up the final rise. The cabin came into view just as the sun slipped low behind the peaks. It was small, built from thick pine logs weathered gray by time. Smoke drifted thin and steady from a stone chimney. A split rail fence circled a patch of land that had once been a garden, but now lay mostly wild. A stack of chopped firewood leaned against the wall. Everything about the place spoke of work and quiet endurance. Clara climbed down slowly, her boots touching the packed earth. "You live alone?" she asked. "Have for a while," he answered. He took the sack of flour and salt from her hands and led her inside. The cabin smelled of wood smoke and coffee. A sturdy table stood near the hearth, 2 chairs, a cast-iron stove in the corner. Clean but plain. No decorations except a single photograph resting on the mantel. A woman, smiling. gone long enough for dust to gather around the frame. He noticed her glance. "My sister," he said. "Died 5 winters back." Clara nodded. She did not ask more. He pointed toward a narrow doorway. "There's a small room in there. Bed simple but solid. You can stay. Work starts at dawn." "What kind of work?" she asked. "Garden needs bringing back. Fence needs mending. And I sell herbs in town twice a month. If you know how to grow anything, you'll earn your keep." Clara thought of her mother's hands in the soil back in Missouri, thought of long afternoons spent pulling weeds and trimming sage. "I know enough," she said. He nodded once. Good. That first night, she lay awake listening to the wind brushing against the cabin walls. She was safe. She had food. She had a roof. But she could not forget the sound of laughter in that store. By morning, she was outside before the sun rose. The garden was worse than it had looked in the fading light. Weeds choked the beds. The soil was cracked and dry in places, but the bones were strong. Rows laid carefully, stone borders still intact. Clara knelt and pressed her fingers into the earth. Beneath the dry crust, it was still cool, still alive. She worked until her back burned and her palms turned red. She hauled water from the well. She pulled weeds by the root. She spoke softly to the struggling rosemary plants the way her mother once had. The cowboy watched from a distance at first. He never hovered, never corrected. But he noticed. Days turned into weeks. The garden slowly shifted from brown to green. Tiny shoots pushed through. Sage leaves opened toward the sun. Chamomile buds began to form, small and hopeful. Clara's hands grew rough. Her arms grew strong. Her shoulders squared. In the evenings, they ate at the small table near the hearth, mostly in silence, but not the uncomfortable kind. The quiet between them felt steady, like the mountain itself. One evening, as they sat watching the fire settle into glowing embers, he spoke without looking at her. "You didn't deserve that." She knew what he meant. "Neither did you," she said gently. He frowned slightly. "What makes you say that?" "No one chooses to live alone in a place this quiet, unless something was taken from them." He did not answer, but the next morning, he left a jar of salve beside her bed for the cracks on her hands. Said nothing about it. 2 months later, the garden was thriving. Bright chamomile flowers dotted the beds like small stars. Rosemary stood tall and fragrant. Mint spread strong along the shaded edge near the fence. It was time for market day. Clara stood in the cabin doorway that morning, brushing the dust from her skirt. She wore the same faded dress, but it hung differently now. Cleaner, straighter. Her hair was pinned neatly back. The cowboy loaded bundles of dried herbs into the wagon. "You ready?" he asked. She took a breath. "Yes." The ride down to Pine Hollow felt different this time. She did not feel small. The market square buzzed with activity when they arrived. Stalls lined the street. Women carried baskets. Children ran between wagons. They set up their table near the water trough. Clara arranged the herbs carefully, each bundle tied neatly with twine, labels written in clear script. At first, people only glanced. Then an older woman approached. She picked up a bundle of rosemary and lifted it to her nose. Her eyebrows rose. "Well now," she said loudly enough for others to hear. "This is the strongest rosemary I've smelled in years." More people gathered. "How much?" someone asked. Clara named the price clearly. Coins began to clink onto the wooden table. The crowd grew thicker. And then, from the corner of her eye, she saw him. Mr. Carter stood near the entrance of his store, watching, his mouth set in a tight line. He walked toward her stall slowly. Clara's hands paused on the twine. Before the shopkeeper could speak, the mountain cowboy stepped forward. He did not touch him, did not threaten. He simply stood beside Clara, steady and quiet. Mr. Carter looked at the herbs, at the coins, at the small line of customers waiting. He swallowed. "Looks like you found your flower after all," he muttered. Clara met his eyes. "Yes," she said calmly. "I did." There was no laughter this time, only the hum of the market and the scent of chamomile drifting on the air. Mr. Carter turned and walked away. Clara exhaled slowly. The cowboy looked at her, just for a moment. There was something new in his eyes. Not pity, not protection. Respect. That evening, as they rode back up the ridge with an empty wagon and a pouch heavy with earned coins, Clara felt something settle deep inside her. Not pride exactly. Peace. But neither of them knew the mountain had one more test waiting, and it would come sooner than either expected. The storm rolled in 3 days later. It came down from the high peaks without warning, dark clouds folding over the sky like a heavy blanket. The wind struck first, bending the pines until they groaned. Then came the rain. Hard. Cold. Relentless. Clara had just finished tying back the mint when she saw the first flash of lightning split the ridge. "Inside!" Wyatt called from the fence line. They barely reached the cabin before the sky opened. Rain hammered the roof. Water rushed down the slope, carving new paths through the dirt. Clara stood at the window, watching the garden take the beating. The chamomile bent low. The rosemary trembled. "Flood will come through the lower beds," she said. Wyatt stepped beside her. "It always does." She turned to him. "Then we move the stones." He stared at her like she had suggested walking into fire. "In this?" "Yes." Before he could argue, she grabbed her shawl and stepped back into the storm. The rain hit her face like thrown pebbles. Mud soaked through her boots in seconds. She knelt in the water, dragging stones from the garden's edge to build a barrier along the lowest row. Wyatt cursed under his breath, but followed. They worked without speaking. Lightning cracked overhead. Water rushed around their ankles. Clara's hand slipped on the slick stones. Her dress clung to her legs, heavy and cold. The chamomile bed was seconds from being swallowed when they finished the barrier. The water hit the line of stones and split, pouring around instead of through. Clara fell back onto her heels, breathing hard, rain washing dirt from her face. Wyatt stood over her, soaked to the bone. "You don't back down from much," he said. She looked up at him, water dripping from her lashes. "I've already lost too much to let a little rain scare me." The storm raged for another hour before it passed. By morning, the sky was clear and blue, as if nothing had happened. Clara walked the garden slowly, inspecting every bed. The lower rows were wet but intact. The chamomile stood upright again, petals open to the sun. She smiled. Behind her, Wyatt watched quietly. "You saved it," he said. "We saved it," she corrected. That afternoon, hoofbeats echoed up the ridge. Clara looked up from the fence line. A wagon struggled up the slope. One wheel cracked and splintered. A man walked beside it, limping slightly, trying to keep the load steady. She recognized him before he reached the cabin. Mr. Carter. His clothes were soaked from the night before. His hat was missing. His pride looked thinner than it had in the store months ago. The wagon tipped sideways as the broken wheel finally gave way. Wyatt moved first, steady and sure. Clara followed. "Mr. Carter did not look at her at first. He stared at the ruined wheel like it had betrayed him. Bridge washed out near town, he muttered. Lost half my supplies. Trying to make it back before dark. He finally looked up. And there she stood. The woman he had laughed at. The woman whose poverty had been a joke in his store. Clara held his gaze. Your axle's cracked, Wyatt said calmly. You won't make it down without fixing it. Mr. Carter shifted uncomfortably. I can pay, he said quickly, reaching into his coat. I don't need charity. Clara felt something twist inside her. The memory of the store, the laughter, the silver locket hitting the counter. She stepped closer to the wagon and placed her hand on the splintered wood. No one said anything about charity, she replied softly. We fix things up here because they need fixing. Wyatt disappeared into the barn and returned with tools and spare wood. They worked together in silence. Clara held the wheel steady while Wyatt replaced the axle brace. Her hands grew dirty again, but she did not mind. Mr. Carter stood awkwardly at first. Then slowly, he began to help. Passing tools, holding the lantern steady when the light began to fade. When the wheel was secure, the wagon stood straight once more. Mr. Carter cleared his throat. I was wrong, he said finally, the words heavy and stiff. About you, about that locket. Clara said nothing. He swallowed. I've been wrong about a lot of things. The mountain wind moved gently through the pines. No crowd. No laughter. No audience. Just 3 people standing in quiet truth. Clara stepped back. Get home before dark, she said. Mr. Carter nodded. He climbed onto his wagon seat, paused, then looked at her one last time. You ever need anything? He began. She shook her head gently. I don't. He gave a short nod and turned the reins. The wagon rolled slowly down the ridge, steady now. Clara watched until it disappeared from sight. Wyatt stepped beside her. You could have let him struggle, he said. Yes, she answered. Why didn't you? She looked out over the garden, over the mountain, over the land she had brought back to life. Because I know what it feels like to stand alone. Wyatt studied her for a long moment. You don't stand alone anymore, he said quietly. She felt that truth settle in her chest. Not loud, not dramatic, just steady. The sun dipped low behind the peaks, casting gold across the chamomile fields. The air smelled of rosemary and clean earth after rain. Clara reached up and touched the silver locket resting against her collarbone. It had never been worthless. Neither had she. She walked back toward the cabin with Wyatt beside her, their shadows long against the dirt. The mountains stood silent above them, and for the first time since she had stepped off that wagon in Pine Hollow, Clara felt like she belonged exactly where she was. There's something quiet about a story like this. It does not shout. It does not demand. It simply reminds us that the world can laugh, storms can rage, and people can fail us. But the way we answer those moments is what shapes who we become. Some of us have been Clara, holding something precious, while others called it worthless. Some of us have been Mr. Carter, learning too late that pride costs more than kindness. And some of us have been like Wyatt, watching quietly, stepping forward when it matters most. Whatever place you see yourself in tonight, let it sit with you, and maybe carry a little more mercy into tomorrow. Thank you for staying to the end.